Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we have a two-video special, a two-for-one. Now, I wasn't originally going to review the Goonhammer article on the balanced Dataslate, but I thought it made a lot of good points, and right after I had basically shared my own opinions on the balanced Dataslate, I had read the Goonhammer article, and I thought to myself, wow, I feel the exact same way, and funnily enough, when I was going over the, Eldari rumored nerfs, I was saying a lot of the same things as what Boon is saying. And I want to read this to you guys because I think it's an important point. A lot of you in that rumor video in the comments section were basically saying that I was maybe incorrect, that GW was nerfing the faction and maybe not nerfing a single player using a unit really well. And I think you guys don't understand, or at least maybe you haven't been around as long as I have, to see the nerfs, to understand the competitive environment, who's winning the tournaments, what lists are bringing, and why GW is actually nerfing units. And I think really what it comes down to is, and I said in my rumor video, that GW was they were being idiots, basically. I wasn't very nuanced in kind of what I was saying there, but I was essentially saying that they were nerfing the top players, and they weren't necessarily nerfing units that needed to be nerfed, but they were nerfing the players themselves for finding creative and powerful ways to use units that maybe weren't so good, or maybe weren't used that much. And I think they've done the same thing with this balanced Dataslate, specifically with the Warlock Conclave. And I kind of spoke about that in a previous video I made today regarding the changes, right? So let's go ahead and read the article here. And I'm going to read it and give you guys context and kind of explain why GW and the balance team need to be a little bit more nuanced with what they're doing with the rules, and they need to actually use their brains a little bit and think about why they're nerfing units. Are they just nerfing it because it appeared in a tournament list, or are they nerfing it because it is truly overpowered? So let's go ahead and read the article on the Eldari. So, the Eldari. Here are the points change nerfs, right? They talk about the points changes here to the, respective units. Lethal Intent got nerfed, of course, and if you guys want to check this out, I have another video on this, so I'm not going to go really into this, but let's hear what Boon has to say. So first of all, just to give you a little context, Boon is a competitive player. He's been on Goonhammer for quite a long time. Very successful Eldari player, and he's a faction specialist, essentially, in the Eldari. So let's go ahead and read what he has to say about the changes. Once upon a time, in 9th edition, D-Scythe Wraithguard were a rarely seen unit of little note in competitive circles. However, during that period, I had created an army build that leveraged them efficiently, and I found great success in using them. In doing so, I won multiple events and carried them all the way to a GW finale best overall win. Was the unit overpowered? Certainly not. But they were effective and they worked very well for my playstyle and needs. When GW pulled out the Nerf hammer and banished them back to the shelf shortly after, I was both bemused and honored. GW didn't nerf D-Sites. They nerfed me. So, guys, this is exactly what I was saying. And this has happened before, and I tried to tell you guys this. Actually, there's a really good interview on Craftworld Eldar, Brent's YouTube channel. You guys should check it out. Back in 9th edition, where Boon is talking with Brent about his Eldari Grand Tournament victory using a squad of D-Sites. And I believe he talked about the squad of D-Sites as something that was just a target elimination tool. It was a little bit expensive for what it did, but he was able to leverage it in the right way to really just hose down units that needed to be destroyed. So he was talking about using it with, in combination with things like Guide, I believe, and I mean, maybe it wasn't Guide, but it was, a combination of psychic abilities that allowed them to be pretty powerful and hit pretty hard. I watched that article, I was really I watched that video, I was really interested in that, and basically, I thought the nerf was just because of him. When the nerf happened, and you can even go back to my videos and double check here, they nerfed Wraith Guard with D sights, and I was so confused why, and then I remembered the Craftworld Eldar video, Brent's video, his interview with Boon. I was like, man, GW really just nerfed Wraith Guard with D sights because of Boon. That's it, right? So I thought that was wild that they did that. That was back in 9th edition, though, when GW balance wasn't honestly at its best. They were nerfing things that were just appearing in tournaments, and it seemed like some of the nerfs just came out of left field. We had no idea why they were being nerfed. Okay, so Boon goes on to say, so when I bounded down the stairs and opened up the preview of the Munitorum Field Manual, MFM, like a child on Christmas, I was taken aback by the lump of coal that awaited me. A nerf to the 4 Warlock Conclave, a unit I had used 2 of since the release, and knew of almost no one else finding success globally with these. Here we go again, I thought. But no, Wings was there to check my ego and politely inform me that something far more incompetent was at play. After all, never chalk up to malice what can be attributed to incompetence. No, in fact, it turns out that the 4 times Warlock Conclave was starting to catch on after all. In Ynnari. So we talked about this as well, right? I called this the Folger Piles nerf because Folger Piles was using this in Ynnari, and maybe a couple of other players were too, but honestly, I didn't know of anybody who won a tournament other than Folger Piles with these, and I don't even think Folger Piles won the tournament that I saw him in playing with these. So I didn't understand the nerf to the Warlock Conclave, and again, I said that people were using Seer Council with Warlock Conclaves to great effect, primarily Boon, right? Because he's one of the only Seer Council players out there. But it's just wild, right? It's wild to me that GW would nerf this because it's not OP. It's just something that is good in certain detachments, and Ynnari was just good in general. So, of course, it just didn't make sense to me. And apparently it didn't make sense to Boon either when they got nerfed, right? So he goes on to say, reader, I think at this point it is fair to ask if GW, like a boy with a misbehaving dog, is responsible enough to continue to have a Ynnari. It's kind of funny. Actually, Boon's kind of a funny guy. He's witty. So, okay, let's go on here. The complete lack of understanding represented in this update is bewildering, and I'd be professionally embarrassed were I responsible. Setting aside for a moment that the rule change to lethal intent was both necessary and obviously warranted during the last update. Okay, so we're talking about the last update now. He's not talking about this one because Boon thinks that the update this time around is way too harsh. The team behind these updates apparently felt that extremely limiting that rule wasn't even enough. They also needed to reduce the effectiveness of Yvrain and increase the cost of common Ynnari units, and even uncommon ones. The 4 times Warlock Conclave took a hit because a single unit of these dared to appear in recent Ynnari lists. And of course, he's talking about Folger Piles here, right? Banshees and Autarchs both took hits. I guess the team believes that these can only be used in Ynnari, or they aren't uniquely benefited by the Ynnari. Then some Ynnari-specific units took additional point increases to make sure everybody was clear that this is now a dead detachment competitively. Yeah, so GW wanted to basically kill the detachment. So that's the discussion that was definitely going on at GW. How do we kill the Ynnari competitively so they never appear again in competitive play, right? And I think also I'm gonna disagree a little bit with the Howling Banshee and Autarch nerf. I think those units are used in a lot of people's detachments. They're just a very good unit. Like, people aren't spamming Autarchs, don't get me wrong, but most people are using Autarchs. I don't think Autarchs were overpowered at all. I just thought they were really good. So I kind of, in the GW mindset, I understand why they were nerfed, because they were a unit that was used in pretty much every list, with some exceptions, of course. And the Howling Banshees were used in almost every list as well, outside of Wind Rider Host, right? So I can kind of understand the small nerf there. Fire Dragons, I know they were used in almost every list, but we really need Fire Dragons. They plug a hole in the obvious weakness of the Eldari to anti-large. We have a real weakness when it comes to killing large targets now with the Codex, and Fire Dragons plug that hole. you know, that's what she said. But unfortunately, you know, I think it's just one of those punitive nerfs again. So let's go on here. So 3 straight editions entering into this update, Ynnari were a problem. Hell, entering into the last update, Ynnari were a problem. Just as been the case in the last update, and has been the case in every update since 8th edition, the wider Craftworld faction suffers at the hands of an overperforming Ynnari faction that GW routinely gets wrong, then blindly corrects by punishing the underlying units. This time, Autarchs, Banshees, Conclaves, and Fire Dragons. Not only do those units not operate in the same way in a non-Ynnari build, they don't operate in the same way in a post-lethal intent change build. The reality here is that the Dataslate adjustments would have been enough to curb Ynnari dramatically. And yeah, it would have. I still think, even without the points nerfs, Ynnari would have been kind of dead competitively. Maybe some people would have still played it, but competitively speaking, it just didn't have any teeth. That's what I thought, right? But then, of course, we saw the points nerfs, right? And Fire Dragons at 110 points and other detachments are A-okay. They're totally fine. They're working as intended. They're not an OP unit. You know, I know a lot of people run them in other detachments, but again, like I said, they plug a hole that we need in the army. Meanwhile, the rest of the faction struggles. Since the last data slate, in almost 5,000 games, non-Ynnari Eldar are averaging win rates of about 45%, with some falling below 40%. An army performing in this manner would expect to see a wide array of adjustments to units that aren't seeing use. But to that, you have to understand the army deeper than Ynnari good, right? Some will make the argument that top players will move and improve the other detachment win rates, which is a thing you say on Reddit when you don't attend tournaments, but think you have it all figured out anyway. The reality is that there are very few faction experts that are also top players. Most players will just hop over to an easier to play faction rather than bang their head against a wall trying to make a handicap roster work competitively. What you have left is a few extremely skilled faction experts finding success, then a mass of players who struggle even harder than they did previously. I expect Eldari win rates to approach 42 to 44% after this update. So let's break this down a little bit. So basically what he's saying here about most of the competitive community is absolutely correct. Most people will just move on to other factions. Let's be honest. I've seen this on my channel as well. People commenting that, you know, I don't know if they're actually competitive players or not. They're just a, you know, anonymous person on YouTube, of course. But there's always a lot of complaints like, oh, I'm just going to play, you know, this army now, right? People hop armies. There's only a few players. There's probably like, I would say, and this is a rough estimate, I would say about 50% of the wider Eldari community. Actually, I'm going to say more than that. I'm going to say about 90%. Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb here. 90% of the Eldari community as a whole is not going to every GT. Okay, if they keep with the Eldar, if they keep playing their Eldars, they're not going to all these GTs, right? Maybe 10% of the Eldari community that considers themselves part of the community is going to GTs regularly, winning games, and so forth, right? And out of those players, a lot of them play other armies as well, right? They're not just Eldari players. They are other players. Maybe they have a Death Guard army. Maybe they have a Thousand Sons army, right? And the new codex comes out, and what do you think they're going to do? Are they going to keep with the Eldari, the nerfed Eldari, or are they going to play another faction, right? Chances are they're going to just play another faction, right? The people that are going to keep with the Eldari are the true ones and the real ones. They might keep with it, but the win rates as a whole will go down, right? Because, yeah, like Boon said, like competitive players want to win, and they want to find easy ways to win. Like, the easier it is to win, the better. That's how it's always been. When I used to play tournaments in 5th edition and 6th edition, that's how it was too. The Eldari, by the way, in 5th edition, especially late 5th edition, were one of the worst armies in the game, competitively. You would go to a tournament, and you would go up against all this bullshit. You would go up against things like Blood Angel Razorback spam with Last Cannon and Twin Linked Plasma, and then you would go against stuff like Wind Blower, Leaf Blower, Imperial Guard, and you'd go up against, Grey Knight, double Psy Cannon spam, and you'd go against all these like crazy things like Psy Ammunition, which was crazy back then. It was like +1 strength, which is a big deal. So all your Wave Serpents, if you went second as an Eldari player during 5th edition on most terrain layouts in tournaments back then, you were just dead. You lost. You basically had to just shake the guy's hand, say good game, and that's it. And you had to find ways around that as an Eldari player, right? It was very hard to find success with Eldari. Most people didn't play Eldari back then. Most people were playing things like Blood Angels, Imperial Guard. They're playing all the OP factions in 5th edition. Okay, so then we go on to 6th edition. And what happened in 6th edition? In the very beginning of the edition, the Eldar still sucked. They still sucked. They were a little bit better, but they still sucked because vehicles got nerfed a little bit in 6th edition. However, what ended up happening is the Eldar got their new codex. And when the Eldar got their new codex, guys, the tables turned. All of a sudden, everybody in tournaments was an Eldari player. I remember going to a tournament early 6th edition during one of my summer breaks. And out of 20 people there, 6 of them were Eldari players. Which is insane, right? Because that's normally not the, that's normally not how many, that's not the spread, right? That's not how many people actually play Eldari. So there were 6 Eldari players there. And they were running all sorts of bullshit. And I had a, kind of a Highlander type list that I used for fun. I played with my roommates and I go to tournaments during the summers or breaks or anything like that. And it was a tale of 2 different stories. One story was anybody who wasn't a Space Elf player, I would go up against, I would just smash. I went up against a Space Elf player in the last round, and I got smashed myself because I didn't get first turn. He got the first turn, and he wiped me clean. And that was the game. And everybody played Eldari back then because they were just the best faction out there at the time. They were just literally the best. Most people are going to just hop factions, right? That's just the case. So when Boon says here, about people on Reddit saying, oh yeah, the Ynnari win rate or the Eldar win rate will go up or whatever because, the skilled players will just play other detachments. Well, he's right. The reality is they're not going to just play other detachments. They're just going to jump ship. They're going to play other armies, right? We've seen this a lot, right? We've seen this a lot. So, like for example, and I'm not saying this in a bad way because competitive players want to win tournaments, right? I'm not saying it in a bad way for them, but let's take Folger Piles, for example. Folger plays Eldari, but he also plays Adeptus Custodes. Is Folger going to stay with the Eldari now that Ynnari is nerfed competitively? Is he going to just jump over to Seer Counts or something like that? Maybe. But I think chances are better that he's just going to play a different army, right? And time will tell. We'll see what army he plays. I don't want to put words in somebody's mouth, but time will tell. And players like him, again, they're going to a lot of them are probably going to switch to different factions. So I think Boon here is right. Eldari win rates, because of the nerf, are going to decrease overall because Ynnari win rates were propping up the faction. If we look at the other detachments, like you said, they weren't doing so great. I personally think that they're great. That's my personal take on them. But in a highly competitive setting, a lot of people are not going to have as much success. And that's just a fact, right? Like, I have a lot of success in my games with the Eldari, but I'm also not playing people like Folger Piles on a regular basis in tournament play, right? So I think the Seer Council detachment will still be really good. It'll be a little bit weaker because of the points nerfs, but it'll still be really good. We'll still see people win with, Seer Council and stuff like that. The numbers just won't be as high. We won't see people win as much or as many GTs. Okay, let's move on here. All right, so Eldar did get positive points adjustments to Fire Prisms, Warwalkers, and Shining Spears. They don't even come close to scratching the surface on solving why these units don't work competitively. So I'll kind of I'll kind of push back against this a little bit. I think the reason why these units don't really work competitively is because they're not cheap enough. Like, Shining Spears are good, but they have really big base sizes, so Shining Spears are kind of hard to use in some competitive settings with, like, terrain and stuff. Fire Prisms don't work right now because, like I said in my previous video, everything has a 4+ invul that you want to kill with a Fire Prism, and just killing rhinos all game really doesn't cut it. I mean, you might want to take one in your list, but I don't think it's going to be that powerful to the point where you want to pay 150 points for it. Again, why not just take, again, Fire Dragons, right? I think the Warwalker was just too expensive. I think its rule is good. I think the Warwalker, its rule is good. I know that you have to shoot it to get the benefit on something, but oftentimes, unless you're, just trying to melt it in one turn with one unit, you're not going to kill something tough in one single round of shooting with one unit. Not one round, but with one single unit, right? So, like, having a Warwalker to support that other unit and make sure that unit kills its target, isn't bad. -1 AP, not a bad rule. I just think obviously Warwalkers are too expensive. I think at 85 points, they're probably still too expensive, just by a little bit. But they're much better than before. Okay, lastly, he says, and this is kind of something I was surprised about in the Dataslate and the Munitorum Field Manual, because I was, like, shocked. I had heard that Space Marines were going to get nerfed, and then all of a sudden, it seems like they just got a bunch of buffs. I do take comfort in the fact that the same approach applied to reigning in Ynnari will undoubtedly be applied to other similar circumstances like Guilliman/Calgar and the Ultramarines. No way Space Marines get a bevy of point drops to compensate for the rule changes, right? Would be ludicrous if they did, right? Right? So obviously he's being sarcastic, because if you read the point changes, Marneus, Calgar, and Guilliman together did get nerfed because now you have to basically have one or the other, right? It's you either have Guilliman in your army or you have Marneus in your army. You can't have both because you can't have two warlords in your army. If you have Guilliman in your army, he must be the warlord, which means you don't get the extra CP from Marneus Calgar. You could still take Marneus Calgar, you just don't get the bonus CP. However, to compensate for this, GW decided to basically make Space Marines cheaper. They made Marneus Calgar cheaper and Guilliman significantly cheaper. Marneus -10 points, Calgar -25. Or excuse me, that's opposite. Sorry. Guilliman is -25, Marneus Calgar is -10. Which is ridiculous, right? So it just kind of shows you that GW really does favor Space Marines. Space Marines have been a strong faction since the beginning of the edition, and they continue to be strong competitively, and they've always been strong competitively in 10th. They were strong competitively for sections of 9th edition as well, to the point where Space Marine armies dominated the meta. And they're still extremely good, right? To this day, Space Marine armies are still doing great. And that's crazy to me, because Ultramarines have won several events. They won Adepticon. They won the most recent big GT. I can't remember exactly what it is. Somebody in the comments remind me, but it was Ultramarines and Ynnari in the finals, and the Ultramarines, of course, won. And it's just, it doesn't make much sense to me why Space Marines are getting all these buffs when they're winning big events. Of course, they should be getting nerfed, right? But see, GW doesn't think of it like that, because they know that if they nerf Space Marines, people will stop playing Space Marines, and Space Marines are 90% of the sales, right? And I think that's really what it comes down to. And I talked about this a little bit before, like, why are they making these nerfs? Why are they doing this and that? They want people to buy new stuff. With all this codex creep that's happening, they want people to buy new stuff because their quarterly reports, are probably coming up, right? They're coming up. They want their stockholders to say, oh, we're doing great, right? And GW is doing well in general. So I think they're just trying to amp up, like any capitalistic machine, they're trying to amp up the profits. And that's not right. I don't think you should base the game off of profits like that, right? Sell your product. You sell a good product already. Keep doing that. But create a balanced game so that things are fair for everybody, right? Okay, so that's what Boon had to say about the Eldari. Obviously, a very scathing review of GW's balancing practices, which I agree with. I've always agreed with it. I think their balancing is off. I think whoever's in charge of the balancing doesn't understand the Eldari and probably never did. And what they do to compensate for their lack of understanding and lack of nuance is they look at the top players and they make nerfs based on those players and not necessarily on the units themselves, which is a shame. Okay, let's look at what some of the other Goonhammer guys say about it, because, you know, there's always a little bit of back and forth between these Goonhammer guys, but basically they're in agreement with Boon this time around, right? So Wing says, normally I'm the voice of elf moderation to Boon's doomerism, but I'll admit I share some of his exhaustion here. The trajectory was locked in the moment lethal intent got missed in the last Dataslate. Now we have to live with the consequences. Bluntly, other than Fire Dragons plus 10, no other increase here is justified once you account for the change to lethal intent. And I would actually stop right there and say even the Fire Dragon nerf wasn't really fully justified. And the faction's going to be in a terrible spot for the next 3 months, with Ynnari outright unplayable due to getting triple tapped with more rules and points changes. The Warwalker and Fire Prism changes are nice, sure, but if you're hitting the best part of the faction this hard, you have plenty of power budget to work with, where you could have spent on, say, the Avatar, or maybe dropping Shining Spears down further than 10 points, especially because they're nowhere near as scary now that lethal intent is dead. I agree with that. Yeah, drop the Avatar a little bit. Drop Shining Spears more. Unlike Boon, I get to be mostly sad rather than angry because I have another army that and that one got surprisingly generous buffs. But I was having fun playing Seer Council, and I'm going to miss that when the pressure of my Canoptic Court build is just being obviously better, pushes me off what is theoretically my main faction. Okay. So yeah, Wings, this is the guy I was talking, this is kind of like the type of player I was talking about. The competitive Eldari player who's good with Eldari but has other armies. He's just going to use other armies, right? He's just going to move on to his Necrons now because Necrons got huge buffs, right? So even though his main faction is quote-unquote Eldari, and truly I don't think he's a true Eldari player, sorry Wings, but if you're just hopping ship, if you're jumping on the bandwagon to the next army, I don't know how much of a true Eldari lover you are. But, you know, I mean, he's right, though, right? I mean, a lot of players competitively are going to do this, and you can't really blame them from a human perspective, but you can certainly blame them for being a dirty Monkai. Anyway, let's go on to what Curie says about this, and he says, all right, non-elf player here weighing in. These changes go too far. Ynnari definitely needed adjusting, and they did that with the rules changes. Most notably with the heavy-handed rework to lethal intent. From that, though, the other nerfs carry a bit too far, and I feel like Eldari will struggle in the new chapter approved rules. Okay, so not much there, but yeah, just basically agreeing with Wings and Boon on the changes. They're not good, right? Lethal intent was hit way too hard. Ynnari was killed competitively, and a lot of other detachments are going to suffer slightly because of the points nerfs as well. Basically, most of it is going to be, except if you're playing more casually, you're going to feel the pain, right? You're going to have to reduce one of the units in your army. Now, what I do think players can do, and I'm going to go into a video about how to adapt to these changes, is if you're using Striking Scorpions, you just sub out a unit of Striking Scorpions in your list for a squad of Rangers, and you're pretty good to go. Rangers didn't get nerfed. Striking Scorpions didn't get nerfed further. Warp Spiders didn't get nerfed. Dark Reapers didn't get nerfed. There was a lot of things that didn't get nerfed and are really good, right? Like Eldar units, we have a lot of good units left. I know there's a lot of doom and gloom here, but honestly, I think you just swap out a couple things and you're fine, right? So overall, I do agree with Boon. I think the Eldar community as a whole, obviously our win rate in competitive play is probably going to go down a little bit. But that was because we were already struggling before. So I honestly don't see that much more struggle out of other detachments. I'm sorry, like unless you were running triple Fire Dragon, triple Howling Banshee, triple Autarch, unless you were running like something like that, your list is probably just going to have to drop one unit, which sucks, don't get me wrong. But in a lot of my lists, I can actually just swap units out for slightly cheaper units. I can kind of do the same thing. Like Striking Scorpions, I can swap them out for Rangers. Done deal, right? I swap one unit of Rangers in there, and I basically have it. The more casual players who are running things like Warwalkers and like, maybe some Shining Spears, they actually have, more points to work with now. So maybe that will offset some of the nerfs. I don't agree with the nerfs, but I don't think it's, we're totally dead in the water. We're going to be a terrible faction or anything like that. I think we were struggling before because the Eldari are a really hard faction to play anyway, and only really good players are having any kind of success in competitive environments. I'll be real. I think a lot of people are just struggling with competitive play right now because the Eldari are a really hard faction to play, and that's how they're set up. And that's just the, long and short of it, is that they're hard to play. I'll be creating a couple of videos that I think will help players navigate the Eldari a little better in the coming weeks, and hopefully can kind of get people a little bit more excited about playing Eldari, because, there's even some talk. I mean, in the Discord, there's been some talk. I'm not going to say who, but there's been some talk of like, man, I really miss the Index. I really miss Index Eldari because they were easier to play. You could build into toughness and you could actually take a hit and stuff like that. And you could still do all the Eldar trickery, but like you could also have something that, could actually take a punch, right? And I understand that. I really do. But I'll also counter with, the Eldari have had units that can take a punch for, several editions. We've always had at least one unit in the army that could take a big hit and survive. And now we don't have that, right? So we have to think of new ways to play around that. That's all. And there's been armies out there. There's armies that exist out there that do not have a big, I can take a punch unit, right? If you look at all the armies in 40K, there are some armies out there that don't have tough units. And that's just how it is. Look at Dark Eldar. They don't have any tough units, really, except Kronos, but they're not even that tough. Kronos and Talos are not that tough nowadays. They used to be back in 8th edition when they were broken, but nowadays in 10th edition, they're a shadow of their former selves. They're tough for Eldar, but they're not tough compared to the entire game, right? So we just have to find new ways to play around it. And obviously, you look at Drukhari lists. Do people not run Taloses? Absolutely, they run Taloses because Taloses are good, right? Wraith Lords are good. They are. They're hit or miss because, they don't get rerolls, like a ton of rerolls like Kronoses and Taloses get and stuff. But anyway, we'll be talking about some possible things that you can do as an Eldari player to, kind of shore up the weaknesses and the troubles of this latest balanced data slate. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, just wanted to say thank you again to all my patrons and subscribers for, really helping the channel out in these last couple years. Thank you so much. If you do want to join and become a Patreon member to support the channel or just join the Discord, I'll leave the link in the description. All you have to do is become a Patreon free trial member at the very least, and you will get access to our Discord. I also want to let you guys know I have a channel store page and an Amazon affiliate link. Check those out in the description as well if you want to grab some Eldar inspired apparel or some, discounted Eldar minis on Amazon. All right, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you also to Boon and Wings and the people at Goonhammer for consistently making cool articles and, good articles with consistent and thoughtful analysis of the changes. Thank you. So anyway, have a great day, you guys, and peace out.